Morning, everyone. Before my opening remarks, Dr. Cheryl Finley, who was our keynote speaker, has a few words to say. Cheryl, all yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Bogues. Good morning, everyone. How are you? Did you sleep well? All right, I did too. Anyway, one of the things I wanted to say to you yesterday evening, which I did not, and I'll say that there are cards outside as well. I have a new position. I've been at Cornell for more than 15 years now, but just this past year, I went down to Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, to begin a new program called the Atlanta University Center Art, History, and Curatorial Studies Collective. And I mention this in the context of what our collective work is here today, because to my mind and to the mind of President and Dr. Mary Schmidt Campbell, who herself is a nationally, if not world-renowned art historian. This is also a project of social justice. We're funded by the Alice L. Walton Foundation, and it's an initiative over the next 5 years to begin a program that will train what we believe will be the next generation of Black art historians and curators and museum world innovators. We work in conjunction with the Spelman Innovation Lab, also with really amazing and profound and long-standing historic collections of African American art at Spelman College and at Clark Atlanta University. We're spread across all 3 campuses at the Atlanta University Center, and one of the big initiatives involved in what we're doing has to do with mentorship and also pairing students with other scholars in the field. And so just as an example, we've taken students to New York City for field study where they've met with curators and artists and museum directors behind the scenes. I also took students just a couple weeks ago to the Williams College, to the campus of Williams College in the Clark Art Institute, where we participated in a symposium on performance art and looking at how performance art has the ability, like site specificity and site-specific work, to transform state institutions, whether they be at a museum or a National Historic Site, or even at a traveling and roving biennial. So I just wanted to mention it. We have a pre-college program for high school students. So if you know any, children, nieces, nephews, brothers and sisters, and I'm happy to speak to anyone about it at any point. And so thank you for giving me the time, Professor Bogues. Yeah. I will. Okay.
Thank you very much, Cheryl. Good morning again to everyone. I want to welcome you all formally to this workshop / conference, From Slave Ships to Black Lives Matter. And let me begin by thanking Dr. Cheryl Finley for the keynote yesterday evening in Maine, Johannesburg, in a place called the Bantu Kitchen. I was the chair chaired the launch of her book, or extraordinary book, on the slave ship in Joburg. I then heard her speak, and right after her talk, I said to her, I'm inviting you to Brown. And so she accepted at that moment, and it was May in Joburg, and she is, and you can see why I invited her. This is the first of many such invitations, I hope, for Dr. Finley to come to Brown University. So thank you very much.
It's my honor.
Thanks as well to the organizing team who organized this workshop / conference, because without them, this event could not have happened. There is a rumor at Brown that the CSSJ staff is the best. It is not a rumor. It is actually very true. The CSSJ staff is the best, and there is nothing that we can do at the center that we can do without their actual fantastic work. And so I would like to thank Shana, Maya, Catherine, and all our student workers who have worked on this, and particularly for the student workers, Nathaniel and Dillian, who worked specifically on this project, for our Castrol State Reading Group, which is Connor, Sophia, and Felicia. I don't see any of them here as yet. And then also I would to say that particular group of the Castle State Reading Group is a very interesting group and gives you an idea of the ethos of the center. We run by research clusters, and we were in the middle of hiring somebody to lead that cluster because the faculty lead the cluster, and the person got something better and more family orientated and went to that place. And what happened was that the actual students just took up the cudgels and said, okay, we can do this. And they set up a castle reading group, and gives you, tells a tale really about the character of Brown undergraduate students. I also would like to thank Media Services, Paul and Giovanni in particular, for the work, and I almost think of them now sometimes as staff of the CSSJ. They're always here doing filming the work that we do. And what you may not know is one of the things that we have to do at the center is that we actually have to raise funds. And in record time, when we decided to have that, when we thought that to raise funds we needed a short video of about 4 minutes, both Giovanni and Paul, really in record time, did the work, shot the video, edited it, re-edited it as we looked at it, and made suggestions, and in record time allowed us to produce a really fine video in about 2 weeks that we had to show at a particular fundraising event on a Friday morning. By the Thursday night, we were ready to roll. On the Friday morning, when we got there, they had it was there. So I really want to thank them for really working very closely with us. Thanks as well to all the speakers who accepted our invitation to come here from many parts of the United States, or from places like Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, or from Salvador in Brazil. Thank you very much for making this journey. Let me say a few words about this workshop / conference and how we at the center conceptualize it and why it has a different character from the usual things that have happened this year in commemoration of what is called the 1619 events. The 1619 New York Times project has become a very important hook in sections of what I would like to call liberal America. The Times booklet has been very important and triggered an entire wave of discussion about racial slavery in American history. Some of the most notable writers and scholars and thinkers participated in this project. And this project, therefore, seems to have galvanized a set of discourses around racial slavery, America, and the consequences of racial slavery, what I like to call the sedimented deposits which travel and today structure our everyday lives in these United States. But it also does it in a particular moment, a moment in which there's a strong national discourse and set of practices that are rested upon anti-black racism. And in this anti-black racism, there's a certain kind of almost perverse pathology at play, in which where you have a black youth who is murdered, that is a disposable black body, and that body can be murdered. And then the person who pulls the trigger charges the family of the murdered black youth millions of dollars. It is a perverse sign of the times in which we live, a time in which we live of white nationalism, and white nationalism that operates in the form of kinds of authoritarian populism. And so that authoritarian populism and white nationalism takes center stage in our conventional politics. And so in the midst of this 1619, the 1619 project emerges. And we applaud it. Not only do we applaud it, we commend it. I mean, we think that it is absolutely important that such a thing happened and the way it has generated discourse. new set of understandings of about on realizations of the ways in which slavery shaped American society. But while we do that, we also at the center like to complicate things a bit. And in that complication, what we would want to suggest are two things. One, that before 1619, there was the indigenous population in this land. And that if one is thinking about the ways in which America was constructed, then you have to also think about the ways in which the indigenous population was treated, the conquest of the indigenous population, and the way in which near genocide was committed against this population, all before 1619. Secondly, we like to also complicate this a bit by thinking about the African slaves in Florida, particularly the ways in which Florida was then conquered by this Spanish colonialism, and the ways in which the African slaves were there from about 1554, the kind of forts that they set up, maroon forts that were set up as many African slaves ran away to places like Fort Moses. In other words, for us, 1619 is really about the British American colonies. And that is very important. But that we should remember that there was Spanish colonies here and there was a Dutch colonies just down the road in New York City. And that the continental North America was therefore part of an extensive European colonial project. And that racial slavery did not necessarily just begin in 1619, that the Dutch and the Portuguese were very much in the slave trade, particularly the Portuguese, from the 1440s. So that in this particular workshop today, what we want to do is to think and congratulate and commemorate 1619 and the ways in which the Africans were brought into the British colonies, but we want to expand the boundaries a bit and to therefore think through in a much deeper way the questions of race and slavery in America and in the Americas in general. And so we begin from that position because for us at the center, the question of racial slavery and colonialism was that it not only shaped America, but it shaped the modern world. And so if we say it shaped the modern world, then we have to think through what are the echoes, or what are the, to use the word again, what are the sedimented deposits of this particular shaping that actually structures our life today. So for us, slave ships to Black Lives Matter was about trying to think about United States, yes, but also thinking about the modern world, the afterlives of the sedimented deposits, which shapes the now. Therefore, when you look at the program, you will see how we have constructed it. Where we thought about it was slave ships, so we began with Cheryl, and slave ships again, and we will have Paul and his colleague from the Smithsonian who will talk about shipwrecks. And then we segued from slave ships to the actual afterlives of slavery. And so we would look at the education, and we have activists who are involved in the business of education, because for us the question of what is called the education to prison pipeline is an extremely important afterlife of slavery. We want to pay attention to that. And then we go into another aspect of the afterlife, and that is the carceral state. And we have Professor James with us, Joy James, who has been working closely with the carceral state reading group. And I really want to give a shout out to her for doing that, because she's also spending an extra day to work with the group with folks in Providence tomorrow. And after that, so taking two elements of the afterlives, education and carceral state, you can't take everything. So we decide that these are the two that we would want to that we would take. We then move to thinking about Black lives internationally. Because, again, what we argue is that racial slavery and colonialism shaped the modern world. And so we construct a panel in which there are people from Addis Ababa, somebody who has a familiarity with the Sudanese revolution, and also, obviously, people who are in the United States, and put that set of conversations together. We do that because I think it's important to understand for us at the center as a Center for Slavery and Justice, that the question of slavery and the abolition of slavery is really also about a certain kind of black abolitionism. And if we follow the tracks of the black abolitionists, we would see that the black abolitionists were actually an international reform movement long before Karl Marx and other people. So that when we are trying to think through the kind of historical tracks that we follow, since we say we start from the position of the enslaved, then we try to think about how do you do that? What a way I like to put it is, what are our obligations to the dead slaves? And in thinking about those obligations, how then do you construct a rigorous intellectual and robust program that pay attention to these particular obligations? So when we think about that on the panel, for us, is really following a track of a certain kind of black abolitionism. And then we end with our colleague from Brazil, because Brazil was the site in the Atlantic world where the most black slaves came. It's just a historical fact. So if you're going to think about questions of the commemorating the business of slavery in the Americas, then you have to, how can you do it without Brazil? And how can you do it without not inviting your colleagues from Brazil to come and reflect on what it is, what is happening in Brazil and how they see it. So that is the concept of the program, which is why it is a little different from many other programs that commemorated 1690. So I wanted to share this with you because it may give you a sense of where the center stands, of how the center thinks about the work that it does at this particular moment. So I want to thank you all for coming. I hope that this day would be a very important day, intellectually, as well as and scholarly, etc. But also very much that new networks and new friendships, if you wish, can be formed out of the gathering that we have tried to put together. So welcome to you all formally to Brown University, to the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and to this particular program. Thank you very much. Having said all of that, what I would like to next to do is to call upon the two panelists for the next for panels. It is the two panelists are Dr. Paul Gardullo and Dr. Justin Dunnavantare, if I get right, and it's about the Shipwrecks project. And as I said, we continuing the motives for the workshop conferences from slave ships to Black Lives Matter. So we just continue trying to think through around the business, around the theme of the ships. And following Cheryl, we thought it was important for people who are working on trying to find the ships and the wrecks of the ships to talk about their work. So I don't want to do any big introductions. Their bios are in the thing. So Paul and Justin, take all yours.
Good morning, everyone. As Catherine's getting set up, I want to thank Tony for inviting us, and I want to punctuate with a large exclamation point, the idea that the CSSJ staff is the best. They have been tremendous collaborators and partners with me personally and with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, where I work for the past 5-6 years on a project that we're developing on slavery in the making of the modern world. And they continue to inspire, provoke, and do so graciously, and also, as you're witnessing today, sweat the small details immensely well in producing programs like this. So thank you, Tony and Catherine and Shana and Maya and the staff. Thanks to Dr. Bogues for your statement. Let me give you a quick overview of how we're going to run this, because in a conference/workshop, we hope to shade a little bit toward the workshop side. I think Dr. Dunnavant, who is a postdoctoral fellow at Vanderbilt University, and myself, he's an archaeologist, I'm a historian and curator. We're going to talk about the work that we do collaboratively, and I think hopefully we'll be a little bit like on the long side of a half an hour, and then be able to have some good discussion. And I think that Dr. Bogues, your comments about 1619 as both a provocation and an invitation, as a moment along a much longer chronological arc, right, that reaches well back before it and to today, that in a place, Port Comfort, ironically named in what is now Virginia, is part of a much bigger geography that encompasses the entire Atlantic world and beyond when you think about colonialism, is important. And I think when we look at things from 2019, then we begin to understand the relevance and the importance of a date from which many dates are important, and why we galvanize, and why memory is so important to us. And I think that in part what I hope that this first talk, this first presentation, this first session does is provide some connective tissue and glue between Dr. Finley's fabulous talk last night, thinking about the slave ship icon, and not just thinking about physical and the reality of slave ships and searches for them, but in thinking about how discussions around slave ships, the slave trade, and slavery are connected to these other issues, right, that we're talking about today. Connected to this expansive notion of Black Lives Matter, right? That's interdisciplinary, that is international, that is very much about our relationship to the past, but also doing so in a way that is respectful, honestly, of this present moment that we're in. How do we develop how do we develop a powerful language about an expansive Black Lives Matter movement while recognizing that this is in the same week that the murderer of Trayvon Martin has sued the victim's family, right? That the Attorney General of the United States has proclaimed that you better be careful and respectful of police if you want their protection, right? And so how do we continue to expand upon and draw the historical links of the Black Lives Matter movement that was born out of some very particular moments around violence, sanctioned violence against Black bodies, right? And so I think that is an area of which we'd love to talk and open up, because I think we're going to make a case that the Shipwrecks project is a Black Lives Matter project in some ways. Not in all ways, but in some key ways. And so the Shipwrecks project, on its most basic level, is a project in maritime archaeology. We search for slave ships around the world. We do so with a desire to take what is a massive trade that shaped our modern world, an instrument and an engine of modernity, and begin to try to reclaim it voyage by voyage, and to bring it to a human scale, and to better understand it. To better understand it not just as a schematic that was produced by abolitionists in the early 19th century, as a powerful political image, and that was readopted, like as we saw last night, right up until today, powerfully by artists, black artists, or as a single medallion, right? Am I not a brother? That was imprinted on snuff boxes or kept by white abolitionists. But to expansively think about questions about the materiality of these ships and how important it might be to understand them materially, both in archaeological terms, but also in symbolic terms for each of us, for all of us, to come face to face with this history. And so the project is a global project. It's international. It begins with the thought of, and with the practice of maritime archaeology, searching for ships that trafficked human beings. But it also has grown to include doing work on maritime landscapes and thinking about the ways in which these ships are connected to landscapes of slavery. And so in order to do this, it is necessary to have a host of different disciplinary partners and international partners. And so we're at work around the world, and I'll give you a brief tour of the places where we're at work. But more than just being a research kind of project that is driven out of an academic institution, it's a museum that hosts this project. And so in that sense, it is inherently about advancing research in a publicly oriented way, about doing community engaged research, about involving the public, about the question of memory and interpretation, and how we not just grapple with this past from a scholarly perspective, but from a conscious community perspective, from political perspective, and how we begin to tell these stories in public where we do our work, whether it's in Africa or the Americas or Europe. And so ultimately, at the heart of both of this work, at the heart of all of this work that's both archaeological in scope and interpretive in scope, museum exhibitions, online exhibitions that we have, is this notion of capacity building and capacity sharing. And that takes shape very basically in questions around training. When we do our work, archaeologically speaking, we are actively building a more diverse cohort of maritime archaeologists who are of African descent or who are African. So, and I'll begin to walk through this. And so it's a sense of, we see our project as a transformative project, as a work that is changing the field of archaeology even as we do this work on the practice of enslavement. And so it's also building, I would argue, a broader sense or a deeper sense of capacity building through the practice of the project. Yes, professional training is important, and Justin will talk a little bit about certain aspects of that. Archaeology, much like museums, has been, was born out of the colonial project, right? Maritime archaeology is perhaps the most colonial of archaeological projects, right? It has been driven in its thought processes for the kinds of vessels it looked for, and in its economic practices by being incredibly expensive, and it has skewed incredibly highly toward wealthy white nations, right? Who tend to search for warships. And so this turns that sense on its head. And our work in training, whether it's in St. Croix, and Dr. Dunnavant will talk a little bit more about this, whether we're training undergraduates at HBCUs to do work on maritime landscapes, or whether we're training professional archaeologists in Senegal to take their work underwater, right? Professional training is at the heart of this, so that institutions can begin to transform themselves, and nations like Senegal can begin to develop their own maritime archaeological programs that are degree granting, right? So this is part of the process of what I'd call capacity building. However, I'd like to posit that there's a deeper notion of capacity building going on here as well. And through this project that is international, that is inherently collaborative, that has global partners whose names you saw on the first screen, the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, the National Park Service, Diving with a Purpose, which is an African American professional advocacy group that involves black scuba divers in mapping underwater landscapes and in working side by side with professional archaeologists to do the work of archaeology, right? That this cluster of global groups in combination with local partners builds a deeper sense of capacity for how we grapple with this history, right? It opens our minds to different perspectives, whether they're international, multilingual, intercultural, interdisciplinary. We have historians working with archaeologists. It provides a sense of how we can craft stories that engage larger public's capacity for dealing with the history, as Dr. Bose has talked about it on many times with me, a history of catastrophe. How do we begin to understand this more deeply? How do we build our capacity publicly to tell these stories of slavery and their afterlives? And so in Senegal, we focus on training and capacity building along with the work. In South Africa, we focus on education and conservation along with the research. And in South Africa, this is where we've begun to do I would say our most comprehensive work that brings together the identification and full documentation of a vessel, the Sao Jose, which was a voyage I'll talk a little bit about in a few minutes, from 1794, which traces an arc, a geographical arc that connects Lisbon to Mozambique, to South Africa, to its intended destination of Maranhão in Brazil, but traces a chronological arc across time from the 1790s to today, where we'll be commemorating its 225th anniversary this month, the anniversary of its wrecking on the coast of Cape Town. And what you're seeing pictures of here is an international team on your right, of people who were trained in conservation, representatives from Senegal, from Mozambique, from the United States, and from South Africa coming together to work on the materials from that wreck in order to begin to build their skills in marine conservation. In the center photograph is an exhibition that opened at Eziko Slave Lodge in December of last year, in the site where the survivors of that wreck were likely taken 224 years before, and were then held captive until they were resold into the Western Cape. And so this project of display, of public truth-telling, of preservation and conservation, of research and discovery becomes a vehicle for us to delineate how I would suggest the search for slave ships in this method, right, can become transformative, can become a Black Lives Matter project, can become a project of reclamation. And that work happens in Mozambique as well. The São José, its physical voyage, its historical voyage began in Mozambique Island. It ended in Cape Town. But our work on reclaiming the memory of that voyage and on sharing the historical story in order to bring it back into memory is a complex one. But it involves multiple nations and people and communities. And so I want to end with just a couple thoughts. And I do see this as I do see this talk as really just hopefully generating ideas for our discussion, where we can talk about these more deeply. But I want to come back to this notion of the way in which this project of reclamation, of transformation, of research and discovery is coming from and is hosted by a museum, and what that means, right? What it means for a museum to be an engine of this kind of work in our current context. And in the pictures that you're seeing are from 2015 at a memorial ceremony for the São José that took place on Mozambique Island and then in Cape Town, where we deposited soil that was given to us by local leaders and placed in this basket, and they entrusted us to bring it as close to the site as possible. And there, in June of 2015, 3 divers, Kamal Siddiqui, who is African American, Tara Van Niekerk, who is South African, and Yara de la Riz, who is Mozambican, all 3 scholars, all 3 divers, all 3 members of the project deposited the soil in an incredibly powerful ceremony that becomes evocative not just of the ability for the project to bring people from various backgrounds together, but to make the past matter deeply into the present. Could a place apart from a museum do this work? Probably. But when a museum does this work, and being a publicly oriented institution that can drive research, the very public nature of the storytelling becomes preeminent. It foregrounds the research. It invites the community into the storytelling process necessarily. And it becomes a statement about what the role of museums should be. in a context and in a world where museums can alternatively be sites of sanctuary, where people can walk away from the issues of their everyday life, or can be sites of colonialism that need to repatriate their objects to the cultures and communities from whom they stole them. We are trying to suggest that this project can not only be a Black Lives Matter, but a project in decolonization, right? More so than even just saying an acknowledgement that museums are not neutral, right? That museums have an active and important political role to play in the world, and this is one way that we can do it. And I think that that is so in keeping with the themes of this conference, the themes of the Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice. I woke up this morning thinking about what does it mean to be in this conference? What does it mean to work in a museum whose was built on the colonial project? What does it mean to be working and teaching and learning in a university whose name comes from somebody who enslaved other human beings? How do we deal with that? How do we work with that? How do we make our institutions transform to make our work matter, to undo those legacies, even while acknowledging them? And so I had a small video from the interactive that we built on the Salle José that allows for us to, that allows our visitors, after they see objects that are on display from the ship in the context of the exhibition Slavery and Freedom. If you've never been to the museum, I hope that you will all come at some point. But we wanted to create an experience for people that was digital in scope, that helped people understand separately from their experience of coming face to face with these objects, a little bit of the work and the thinking and the research behind it. And so visitors on a digital table can take journeys from the wreck site to the archives to the conservation lab in doing what we call artifact journeys. And at the end of each artifact journey, once you've discovered an object, learned about it and its historical context and how to preserve it, learned about some thorny questions of belonging and memory and issues of race, we end with this question. We end with this small outro about who does this story belong to, with an invitation, with a soft invitation, I would say, for all, that it belongs to all of us. So I'll end with this and turn it over to Justin. I'll read this because it's small. These shackles lead us on a continuing journey. In Cape Town, they bring this story into memory. It means acknowledging slavery's history in the region. In the village of Moçaril in Mozambique, bringing this story into memory provokes memories for people whose ancestors were lost and have now been symbolically found. The story of the Salle José reveals much about the global scope of the slave trade. I can't read this fast. What started as a site of a shipwreck in Cape Town has connected us to Mozambique, the United States, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Brazil. These artifacts, documents, and sites left behind bring us closer to those who were enslaved aboard, but they are just the beginning. Who does this story belong to? Who is responsible for bringing it back into memory? How will you choose to remember it? And we end on the wreck site off on Clifton Beach, which is one of the most expensive pieces of real estate on the African continent. And it brings us face to face with the sense that this past of violence, this past of slavery and oppression is just offshore. It's just submerged. It's sometimes beyond our scope of belief, but it is right there waiting for all of us. to encounter it and grapple with it and deal with it. So with that, thank you.
Thank you. For the interest of time, I'm going to run through this like Usain in 100 meters, so we can get to some good discussions. Again, my name is Dr. Justin Dunnavantare, currently at Vanderbilt. I'm also the co-founder and current president of the Society of Black Archaeologists, so I want to couch that into the larger conversation around the work that we do in Little Princess and St. Croix, the estate Little Princess. Dr. Gardullo and the rest of the Shipwrecks project had this vision of doing this collaborative program in St. Croix, teaching youth in both terrestrial archaeology and maritime archaeology. And at this time, I was a graduate student focusing my dissertation research in Ethiopia, and they invested seed funding into allowing us to start this program. So I appreciate you having faith in graduate students. And I didn't tell my advisor while I was doing this. But the Estate Little Princess is an archaeology project that we run currently in St. Croix, and we really set it up in response to one of the needs we found in archaeology, which is after interviewing a number or the few successful Black archaeologists, they all mentioned that a field school where they felt supportive was a very key instrument and one of the reasons why they got into archaeology and stayed in archaeology. So we saw this as an opportunity to both fulfill the needs of the Shipwrecks project as well as to develop an infrastructure and a pipeline to build out archaeologists. In addition to that, we wanted to change the nature and the way that archaeology is done and conceptualized. And so one of the things we've been trying to pioneer is this idea of sustainable archaeology. So in addition to mapping slave shipwrecks and documenting the history of slavery through archaeology, we're actively trying to do more work to be restorative. And restorative not just to histories, but also restorative to environments. So we pulled our definition from the UN World Tourism Organization's definition of sustainable tourism. And we define it as archaeology that takes into account both the social and environmental impacts while addressing the needs of local stakeholders and really taking seriously this need to account for capacity building within localized industries. We realize that archaeology is not a lucrative field, and therefore there are a lot of people that are going to learn from the experiences of archaeology but go into other fields that may be more suitable for their community needs. So sustainable archaeology really builds off this larger conversation of community-based engaged archaeological work that a number of scholars have been talking about. And it's really talking about community stakeholders as partners in the formation of the research questions. So this project was unique because we started with the idea of a training program as opposed to a research question and allowed that to come out throughout the course of our research. And I'll talk a little bit about what our research looks like. We also talked about countering the environmental impacts of the archaeological work we do. A lot of times as archaeologists, we're actually clearing areas, we're digging, and we don't think about the environmental impacts of our actual physical work. So we want to do some sort of restorative work in that, particularly to the local environment, as well as taking into account the cultural as well as the natural heritage that's present in many of these locations and realizing that oftentimes they're inextricable. And then finally, again, taking into serious account this need of training local stakeholders. And one of the things we've realized, again, is that archaeology isn't necessarily the field for everybody, but there are many skills and understandings that people can learn from archaeological work. Or in the case of St. Croix, where you have a large dive industry, a potential way to employ local Crucians in the scuba diving industry, where they have largely been left out of. So again, this builds off a lot of work on community-engaged archaeology. All right, so my mother taught me growing up that you should always underpromise and overperform. So when we started this project back in 2016, we did a lot of couch surfing to set up the project, and the Shipwrecks project gave us seed funding to do a 1-week terrestrial archaeology training program that would add on to a longer maritime scuba diving certification program. So our colleagues or junior scientists in the sea collaborated with the then Boys and Girls Club of St. Croix. They trained 12 youth in scuba diving, ages as young as 13 up to 17, 18 years old. And then they spent a week with us in St. Croix at the Estate Little Princess doing archaeology. And we brought in Alex Jones from Archaeology in the Community, and she really took seriously this idea of training youth. So we have a pre and post evaluation for the students. We gave her the 9th grade science curriculum for St. Croix. She incorporated that into the instruction. And then we also took seriously about introducing not just the history of St. Croix, but also looking at artifact identification. How is it that you can identify certain maker's marks on bottles, different ceramic types, and those sorts of things, just to expose students to the full spectrum of what archaeology and heritage tourism can be. And then we had a panel of actual Cruisians on the island that work for Park Service and work in the tourism industry to talk about the potential outlets there. From that first year, they gave us lemons, we made lemonade. We expanded it to a UC HBCU program. We got a $250,000 grant from the University of California to take HBCU students with us to do this work. And we thought that was important because as a Howard alum, I was one of the last graduates of their anthropology program before they shut it down. And we realized that that was one of the main feeders into archaeology as a discipline. And so we figured this would be an opportunity to expose youth at HBCUs to the field of archaeology, even though they don't have actual coursework available in it. And so we bring them out to St. Croix every year. We just put out the call this year, so anybody who's got HBCU students, hopefully we can do some collaborative work and get those out there. Yes. UCLA has a diversity and conservation program as well, so hopefully we can get all three of those and begin to create a network of potential students to work together on that. But we take them out to California for 1 week. They go to UC Santa Cruz and UC Berkeley. They get the basics of archaeology, and then they spend 4 weeks with us in the field in St. Croix. We tried to get them to Haiti. So the first year, a few of them did go to Haiti, but because of the political situation, they had to leave early, and they all came with us to St. Croix. Every year, the project expands, and so last year, we expanded the program because it was so successful. We went from 4 students to 6 students. They allowed us to bring back the students from the previous year, and they really come from all different backgrounds. So we have environmental scientists, Africana studies majors, different areas. And we exposed them a little bit to museum studies through the work of Smithsonian and Mary Elliott and the work that they're doing in setting up a local exhibition. And then we gave them a Discover Scuba. And we realized that we had to actually formalize this process because Jewel, in the middle of that photo over there, didn't tell us that, one, she didn't know how to swim the first year she came and decided she was going to teach herself in the ocean. And after she almost drowned and told us, we said, we need to create a formal process around this. So she taught herself how to swim. She got an A in swimming at Howard. And we're setting her up to work with local divers now to get dive certified. And she's applying to PhD programs in archaeology right now. So we think the idea, it's working at the university level, and we're trying to get University of Virgin Islands students in the program as well, and then again expanding it beyond larger HBCUs. And so far to date, we've trained 18 youth in scuba diving. 2 of them have been employed in local dive shops. When we first got to St. Croix, there were no Cruisians that were employed in local dive shops. We have 3 that have worked for National Park Service and Youth Conservation Corps. 6 students that annually go now to the Moat Marine Lab through the work with junior scientists in the sea, so they're interested in marine biology. We also have 10 HBCU students that have been trained, and 2 graduate students currently producing PhD research in St. Croix. One of them is actually studying water conservation and water management around plantation systems historically, and the other one is looking at a free black community, Free Gut, in Frederickstead. So we're trying to explore the full spectrum of what life was like in the Caribbean. Again, we also try to be very intentional with how we set this up. So myself and co-founder Ayanna Flewellen really tried to build out a full comprehensive program beyond just the training itself for the students. It's also a training opportunity for us. So what we do is Dr. Flewellen has developed her own research as well as this pipeline. So we rotate the PI position every year because we realize the politics of academia. And so we all get experience with managing the budget, running the logistics, as well as handling different aspects of the program. Dr. Flewellen is interested in sartorial practices, so she's focusing on dress and adornment through archaeology in St. Croix. Dr. Alicia Odewale at University of Tulsa is interested in rural versus urban enslavement in St. Croix. Dr. Alex Jones has archaeology in the community. She's interested in the youth training program, so again, she's tracking these students over time. And Dr. Bill White is interested in contemporary questions of race and how it's looked at not just in St. Croix, but throughout the Danish West Indies, or now U.S. Virgin Islands, and in Denmark today as well, and how they grapple with the fact that they were and still are a colonial power, if you look at Greenland and some of their relationships in Ghana. And then myself at Vanderbilt, I'm exploring this idea of ecology and slavery and the environmental impacts of the slave trade. And hopefully we can get that into some conversations about this idea of reparations and sort of what this longer question of environment and ecology looks like. So this is a question that we actively explored, I believe that was last year now, time flies, yeah. Last year in UC Santa Cruz, we set up a conference, a small conference on emerging ecologies looking at archaeology and ecology specifically related to the slave trade. And so we had Judith Carney as the keynote, and we talked a little bit about the different ways that environments have been impacted throughout the transatlantic slave trade and the ways that archaeologists have and are currently approaching this question. St. Croix is a unique place, and really this question came to me out of interacting with people on St. Croix as well as the archaeological history and material on St. Croix. So one of the things that's prevalent is the many different ways in which the environment is constantly changing and the ways in which it's constantly being degraded contemporarily. So we said we can look at this historically. This is not a new phenomenon, but has been happening over the last 400 plus years. So one of the things that sticks out is coral mining. St. Croix is known as one of the top dive spots in the world because of their coral reefs. But coral mining has been going on there and continuing for over 250 plus years. And a lot of that was actually used for housing construction and building construction because coral or sea stone was seen as a preferable building material than the local limestone. So some of the work I'm doing is a little more scientific. I'm using GIS and early maps to actually identify potential sites where coral was mined. And there's a whole oral history around this area, but you can see some of the changes in the NOAA maps in depth, and some of that is actually said to have been carved out by rum runners to allow them to navigate certain areas along the coast. So they were actively destroying the coral reefs to be able to continue their illicit trade in rum. More contemporarily, a lot of hotels have actually blown up pieces of the coast, literally with dynamite, so that they could have these pristine beaches that people could swim in. In addition to that, we're looking at things like deforestation. I'm looking at sediment cores. One of the things people don't often realize is when you build a plantation, the first thing you have to do is spend years often clear-cutting rainforests, in the case of St. Croix, or other land masses. And then there's also the issue of deforestation in terms of actually burning the wood when they shift from wind to steam production, and what that looks like when you need massive amounts of fresh water and massive amounts of wood to continue the steam production. So we're doing some analysis of wood taxa to talk a little bit about the change where they shifted from hardwoods to eventually burning sugarcane waste because they didn't have actual hardwoods to burn anymore. And then looking at seed taxa for the food ways in which they're being used. And then looking more long-term about soil fertility and actually the presence of heavy metals in soils, which is a study that actually archaeologists have done in Antigua, looking at heavy metals as a result of rum production and how that persists even today, even though this rum production ended more than 50 plus years ago. So we're keeping that scientific component as well. I won't go too much into the archaeological research. I normally save that for the archaeology conferences, but but we are actively excavating the area where the enslaved Africans on this plantation actually lived to get at that story and to get a better understanding of what life was like under Danish enslavement, because most people don't associate the Danes with slavery. And so we've actually excavated some of those quarters. And you'll see here from the tile floor, a lot of these houses were actually used into contemporary times. So the area we're looking at, some of these houses were used into the 1960s, before people were actively pushed out and sent to the local housing projects. The archaeology we do is very slow, particularly because we focus on training. So this small little area of roughly 8 excavation units is what we've excavated over the last 3 years. But from that, we've gotten interesting information. I can talk about the artifacts later, but specifically around bedrock modification. So we're talking again about how environments have been changed as a result of the transatlantic slave trade. And initially, we're trying to understand how shared space was used, because we understand these housing quarters were very small. So we wanted to understand that shared space, and we found that there was evidence of bedrock modification for post holes. And we're not sure if they were post holes to build additions onto the cabins, or if they were to build separate freestanding structures in between cabins. Until this year, where we found additional post holes, and we think that they actually might refer to some Taino and pre-Columbian housing establishments that were on the area as well. And this has got us more seriously thinking about the fact that when we talk about genocide and when we talk about the removal of Tainos or other native communities, a lot of it's intentional, because a lot of these communities were established in preferable areas, near freshwater areas and near other favorable areas on the island. And so it's not just a haphazard genocide that happens and then they set up shop based off of their own European ideas, but it's an actively taking and claiming native spaces. And then we're trying to think actively of the ways that African communities are then remaking self in those spaces. So when you all get that Black Metamorphosis book finished, we appreciate that, so we can think more seriously about that. And it's also got us thinking more seriously about what a Black historical ecology looks like. In archaeology, this idea of historical ecology has really focused on pre-Columbian communities and hasn't really been applied to contemporary Black communities in the diaspora. But we're realizing that there's a lot of overlap and a lot of similarity. So looking at the ways in which violences to the land are directly tied to violences to the body, not just in the ways that violences are marked, but actual physical violence that's required for this work. So there are accounts of coral mining where you have enslaved Black divers that are going down and they intentionally blow out their eardrums so they don't have to equalize every time they go down. And that creates a visceral violence to the physical body that's in perpetuity. We're talking about the ways in which terrestrial and maritime landscapes are commingled and can't be separated. The way that natural and cultural sites are imbued with meaning and memory making. There's a lot of historic trees on St. Croix. They have the largest concentration of baobabs in the Western Hemisphere, although they don't drink baobab juice and they don't really eat the baobab fruit. There are a number of oral histories and oral traditions tied to the baobab tree, though. And then there's a need to interrogate this idea of plantation logic, and again, the aftermath of plantation, which I'm sure we'll talk about in the carceral states panel. And we ask, what does this mean from an environmental perspective? What is the afterlife of slavery and the environment? And that's something that we really want to seriously consider, especially when we talk about reparations. It's not just economic, it's not just social, but we're actually talking about what does an environmental reparations look like to communities that have been, and lands that have been damaged as a result of this transatlantic slave trade. But we also don't want to end on doom and gloom. So it's also this idea of historical ecology and marronage, and what are some of the ecological knowledges that maroon communities had, and ways that they used it. And I'm not going to talk about it here, but some of the work I'm currently doing is mapping ocean current data from St. Croix out to other areas, and specifically Puerto Rico, and looking at the ways in which maroon communities had active knowledges of these ocean current patterns and were able to go at least from St. Croix to Puerto Rico to escape slavery, or potentially coming back and forth as a sort of maritime underground that people have talked about. And then today, just to bring it forward to contemporary times, rum production still goes on in St. Croix. They no longer grow the cane on the island. So again, we're talking about some of that violence is actually being transplanted to other areas. But the rum production still persists. And Crucian Rum Factory prides themselves on being the longest continually run rum production operation in the Caribbean. The family recently sold to a larger conglomerate, but they still have a big holding in the area. The production factory still happens on the same plantation, the Diamond Estate, that used to grow the rum. And it's a sense of pride for them. However, it's also vastly damaging to the waters around St. Croix. And so a 1979 EPA study found that actually a lot of these algae blooms that you see in these models is a result of the runoff from the rum production that happens in St. Croix, and specifically with Crucian rum. And so they've been working to try to mitigate that, but it's a persistent issue. And actually southern St. Croix has some of the lowest taxa diversity of fish and coral anywhere else in the island as a result of this. So part of the work we're trying to do, again, and thinking through this panel, I've often been reminded of the idea of remember, remind, and restore. And so part of the work we're trying to do is restoration work. And so in addition to doing the terrestrial archaeology work and the maritime work, we actively work with coral reef restoration as well. We work in Florida, off the Florida Keys, and the local youth in St. Croix actually work in St. Croix with the Nature Conservancy. And they're helping to clean some of these coral trees and coral nurseries so that the coral can then be outplanted onto these reefs and continue to grow and persist. And we've also found that this is a good way to continue training of these youth while we have not located an actual slave ship for them to explore yet. So they get their training in scuba diving while also getting knowledge of the environment around them and having a better appreciation for the natural resources on the island. And I'm going to end there, and that'll give us 15 minutes. And then we can talk a little bit more later about that as well. Thank you.
Thank you both. We have about 15-20 minutes so for Q&As. So people just come to the mic. The staff is saying yes, yes. Come to the mic, which is there and there for their with questions and comments, please. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you. This is so rich. I feel like I need to listen to this like 3 more times slowly to get everything. I'm curious whether there is a conversation with indigenous community archaeologists. I know here in Rhode Island there's been a collaboration between the State Archaeology Office and the Narragansett Tribal Archaeology Office around archaeological work on sites, for example, connected to King Philip's War, so-called, and to the salt marsh site near Point Judith that's been excavated by a joint project. But there are also offshore indigenous villages that are now in the continental shelf. And I just wondered if the black archaeologists and the indigenous archaeologists are in a conversation together, because you're transforming the field, and it matters.
I don't know how this microphone works. Can you all hear me?
on.
Okay, it's on.
Yeah, it works.
Perfect. Yeah, that's a great question. I would say informally, yes, we're in conversation constantly. Through the Society of Black Archaeologists and us individually as colleagues, we constantly go back and forth with our indigenous colleagues. One, because they've been the ones that have really championed a lot of the work of decolonizing archaeology.
Yes.
Because they've been in the field much longer than we have. And it's directly impacted them to a much longer extent than we have. In St. Croix, it's unique because they like to promote this idea that all the Taino were eradicated from St. Croix. That's not true, correct. So a lot of people who claim Taino ancestry actually go to Puerto Rico to practice and to connect with their Taino communities. In addition to that, I recently participated in Lakota Inipi, and it reminded me of this fact that there is ancestors that are not just our ancestors, but ancestors tied to land. There's ancestors tied to water. There's ancestors that are specifically tied to these geographic places that we have to account for and acknowledge. And so it's also got me rethinking this idea of what is the relationship that the pre-Columbian community had to these lands. And it made me more intentionally realize the fact that you can't separate these islands. So you have Tainos that are living partially in Puerto Rico and seasonally in St. Croix, and seasonally in St. Thomas and St. John. And these islands are not separate places, but actually interconnected. And so some of the work I'll be doing this year is actively exploring what does that look like pre-Columbian situation amongst Tainos? What does it also look like in more historical context with African diaspora communities? So those are just some of the ways that we're pulling from what indigenous communities have already been talking about.
And I think just to further complicate this, right, I mean, the context within the Caribbean or the Americas is quite different than in Africa. And so the question of indigeneity is a different and related question. And with the project itself, the broader project as international, the effort is to also bring people from different geographic regions together. So when we're doing active work on field sites in Mozambique, where the effort is to bring a variety of people from the project there to work with Mozambican archaeologists, and vice versa. We've had folks from Senegal and Mozambique come to St. Croix. They haven't worked with Justin specifically on the State Little Princess, but have done other work with the National Park Service. And so the levels of complexity are embedded, and sometimes they're formalized, and other times they're more, ad hoc, right?
Great, thanks. Yes, please. Could you just say who you are, if you don't mind? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Chris Roberts. I was a postdoctoral fellow here last year, Africana PhD out of Temple, and now I teach at RISD. So that's a little bit about me. And shout out to the Africana Studies Department, CSSJ, and everyone who helped pull this together. I'm glad to be here. And my question is sort of for both of you here. One of them is on this discussion around commemoration. So I do work myself on memory, memorialization, monumentality, and I personally have a lot of trepidation around projects of commemorating in memory, particularly those sort of spearheaded by sort of state-located institutions and state-adjacent institutions. So I'm wondering how are you all thinking about handling or working through that tension? Because commemoration so often is seen as a stop point, a period. Okay, we've acknowledged, we have commemorated, we are done. So how do you see your projects as pushing back against the sort of finality that often comes normatively with commemoration? And the second question is really one that I was thinking about as you all were talking relative to conversations around environmentalism and sort of quote environmental justice. And one of the things that I've noticed is some are arguing for a move away from people a lot of ways, right? And there's this idea that to save the environment, we should focus less on like human related issues and move more in the direction of sort of an animal studies, or move in the direction of, okay, how do we think about, how are you all keeping people
Right.
involved in these discussions of environment when, at least from my perspective, I see in some ways a turn away from the person and a turn to other things, be they sort of what we see as quote nature or quote the environment more broadly, particularly given work around ships that had people on them, right? Like how do people remain in the work? At least where I see it, sometimes people are the last thing that some folks want to talk about. And thank you both.
Right.
Thank you. Really good question. On the last, I'll let Justin take the lion's share, but I will say that that part of this effort always, we're people-centered, we're human-centered in terms of the research, and that is at the heart of what the Shipwrecks project is about. It's honestly not as about the ships. It's about reclaiming memories of people who retained their humanity despite the worst of experiences, or retaining human stories around the people who resisted on 1 in 10 slave voyages, right, and were part of revolts, or who took their lives into their own hands, right? And so that isn't exactly what you're asking, but it's deeply embedded in the ethos of what this project is about, and it's about complicating that sense of humanity, and acknowledging what Dr. Bogues referred to as the legacy and archaeology of Black abolitionism on the one hand, as something that is not pictured right within templates of slave ships from the Brooks, or of supplicant Africans who are asking to be freed, right? It's a little different than what you're asking about, but I think it's important. I think I had something to say on the former, but I'm going to let it be to let you speak.
Yeah, no, I think that it's a very important question. 2017 was the 100th commemoration of the Danes selling St. Croix to the United States and the Danish West Indies to the U.S. And usually the biggest colonial contexts often have some of the most power anti-colonial work happening. And so a lot of Crucians complain that Emancipation Day is July 3rd. July 4th is U.S. Independence Day. July 4th is probably the biggest event outside of St. Patrick's Day in St. Croix, which makes no sense in many cases. But it's also brought up this idea of what are then these Crucian communities doing to combat that. And one of the things we found is lots of things happening. One of it is the ways that they're commemorating some of these historic trees. They have a whole grassroots organization that's not just identifying and reclaiming the memory of these trees and actively going on an annual basis to check on these historic trees. But then there's also a local environmental group that's actually been giving out fruit trees. They give breadfruit trees, mango trees, and they give them out to community members with the understanding that, one, they're allowed to come on and check on them annually to make sure that they're doing well. And then two, when they start to bear fruit, they get a percentage of that fruit that they can then redistribute out to the community. So there's restorative work that's also being tied into some of these community-based groups, and they're very hesitant to bring in state actors for many of those reasons. Outside of the commemoration part, the environmental justice part, I'm just now getting into this conversation of environmental justice, and I'm realizing as I'm doing this historical work, I need to be actively involved in the contemporary work. And one of the things I'm noting is that there's a very colonial overtone to a lot of EJ work that's out there, particularly when we talk about hurricanes and natural disasters in the Caribbean. some of the first groups that want to come in are ones to protect the dogs and the cats that are stray, while there are people still living without water and without roofs over their head. And that's an active conversation that I think needs to be addressed and needs to happen more seriously. So one of the things we try to do in all of our work is center people first while we're talking about this. And also be serious about the idea of what it means to live in some of these islands. We read about hurricanes that have happened historically that have been just as bad, if not worse, than some of these hurricanes. And we need to actively think about what does it mean to live in a hurricane, earthquake-prone environment. So I think that's one component.
And I would say in a hurricane-prone environment that was shaped by the plantation economy in some key ways.
Correct.
So contemporary questions of global climate change are also compounded and confounded by islands that have been deforested and in these ways that you just saw. So.
Yeah, thank you.
And yeah, please.
Hello, I am Camille Gentle-Spirit, and I am Associate Professor at Roger Williams University, which interestingly is in Bristol, which is a whole other complicated slave history. But my question is related to heritage tourism in and around plantations in the Caribbean. So I'm thinking specifically in the Jamaican context. There is Rose Hall, and there are all these hotels and beaches and stuff built up around this plantation. And visitors are encouraged. This is a part of the tourism site that tourists are asked to go into. And so I'm wondering if your project also includes or is planning to include conversations with tourism boards in the Caribbean, such as in St. Croix, around how to have people and visitors engage with these sites in a way that's more conscious and more transformative as opposed to voyeuristic and colonial.
Yes, it is, and most of our work, however, is not with private sites. It's with the National Park Service in the St. Croix context. But that's a deeply needed area, and so part of the work that we do is also not just working directly with our partners, but catalyzing and amplifying the work, some good work that's already being done. In the context of St. Croix, there's an organization called Chant, which is focused on doing some work with youth on uncovering and rebuilding the free gut community that was a maroon community, correct? Or it was just a free village? So it was a free black community. And they're also invested in, I can't remember exactly what the acronym stands for, but they're a cultural heritage tourism agency. And so we sort of work alongside them rather than working directly with them at this point, just because of our capacity is just not there. But it's deeply, deeply needed. It's needed in the United States as well. It's needed in Brazil. It's needed in all of these sites where these tourism industries are continuing to trade around this sort of bloodless nostalgia of what slavery was.
Yeah, and I would say working in archaeology, tourism, museums, we're working in, again, areas that are heavily colonial in their foundation and in their perpetuation. And one of the things that we're actively trying to do is, one, refocus audiences. So the audience historically in places like Rose Hall hasn't been local Jamaicans, specifically from that area. We make sure that all the work we do focuses on local Crucians and the purposes for that, which often means then we shift the attention away from the economic realities in terms of being able to produce massive economic change through tourism and refocus it on catalyzing social change. In many ways, I guess, building off of what we're talking about, the revolutionary theater that Amir Baraka spoke of, because we realize that we don't want to oversell what archaeology and tourism can do. You can't create a massive financial industry that's lucrative based off of heritage tourism. And if you do, you're likely going to be doing some colonial things to make that happen. So we realize that the main change that can come from it is the social change and the conversations and the realities that are sparked from those conversations.
Anybody else? Yeah, please. This has got to be the final question. Oh, sorry, and then Cheryl. Okay, quickly. Yeah, go ahead.
You want to go first?
I just want
Yeah,
to follow up kind of on how you ended this question, if that's okay.
Yeah,
So the question that was posed and then your answer also made me think about, some of the different kinds of projects that happen around heritage tourism, around landmarking through UNESCO. And so if you could speak to that, I would appreciate it, because I think that also, for me, often makes me consider, well, can one, make billions of dollars off of this kind of tourism, which I think is highly problematic. I'm not advocating for it, but I think that some of the kinds of efforts that happen on an international level that are promoted and condoned by organizations like UNESCO with landmarking lead to other avenues where commercial interests are taking hold of these kinds of narratives about histories relating to slavery and the slave trade, and not taking into account really the contemporary problematics of the tourism industry that you're speaking of specifically in St. Croix and other places. Thank you.
That's a huge topic, and it relates directly, I think, to the gentleman from RISD's first question around being mistrustful of official commemorative activities, and I think it's absolutely right. I think as working at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, right, we are seeing the desire on the part of people around the world to do work that I think positively engages Black history in really important and profoundly transformative ways, and we're seeing operations and projects around the world that are continuing to capitalize, and I use that word consciously, on this history, and in inauthentic, for lack of a better word, ways. And what I can say is that, maybe it's a cheap answer, but short, is that hopefully our project is built to provide a model that is unlike UNESCO. And leave it at that.
Yeah, and I would just add to that too, that part of the looking at the definitions of how UNESCO defines these sites, often there's a level of sort of hagiography or sort of reverence towards big people or big figures. When we look at colonial context, very few of those people were actually good people. And so we're recapitulating this idea that you have to be this big monger or whatever to actually get recognized in those ways. And then on the ground level, actually NPS has a bigger influence than UNESCO does in St. Croix on a daily basis, National Park Service. And we've actively talked to people about getting sites designated as historic places, and the positives and the negatives that come with that. Because some people say, I would love my site to be designated, but that means that any restoration work I do on my house is going to require specific materials, which I can't afford to do. So what happens when a hurricane hits and I need to rebuild now, and the insurance company isn't going to pay me what I need to be paid, plus I have to use these materials. So there's all kinds of other factors that go into that, especially because they're about to put up a vote now to see if the entire island of St. Croix will be recognized as a heritage site. Yeah.
Okay, one more question. Yeah, there you are.
So I came in a little bit late. My name is Ailton Barboza. I come from the Center for Latin American Caribbean Studies at Watson. My question is a little bit personal and kind of contemporary. You spoke a little bit about rum production and the effect of rum production in the islands. So I come from Cape Verde Islands, and we have traditionally rum production there, and to this day. And my question is, how do you, knowing the history of rum and how rum helped slavery and the relationship with slavery and rum, how can you consolidate and still value a product that comes from your country and talk about that history? And also, as young people, we are, and moving to US too, and African Americans, and our emphasis on drinking, for example, Hennessy or drinks of those sorts that have a colonial and slavery history. So how do you find that balance? Do you just say to young people, don't drink this stuff because you are supporting something that was horrible from the past, or do you say, you know what, embrace it, but know your history? So how do you find that middle ground? Sorry, it's not an intellectual question.
No, it's an intellectual question. You want to take it? No, you go ahead. Okay, so I think one of the things I learned, we all live with contradictions, and we have to understand what contradictions we're willing to live with. I stopped drinking rum after I started doing this research. That's me personally. But I also realized that there are many African communities use rum for libations, You use rum in many different ways as a source of cleaning. And so there's other ways that we've been able to use this product that has been so damaging to us as communities. So I think keeping that in mind is important. Also understanding that some of the best rum distillers have been making their own rum on the side in very remote places. And so that's also another component to this larger conversation around rum production. But I think it gets back to that idea of actually, I think going through that effort and actively exploring the history and the contemporary interactions of rum production is one way to engage, and then you can make an informed decision about how you want to move forward in that way. I don't know how rum is produced in Cape Verde, if there's a different way that they go about it, but yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks very much.